Anger in Armenia. Protests sweep the nation as the former president goes back on his word and returns to power. Could it spark a revolution? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmakers are the protesters in Armenia. Well, he stepped down after serving his 2 terms as president. But 8 days later, Serge Sargsyan was back in power, only this time as prime minister. The decision was a blow to many Armenians. Sargsyan had promised he would respect term limits and not return to office. But following a referendum that changed the system of government, Sargsyan came back more empowered than ever. Thousands took to the streets condemning the move and the lawmakers that voted him in. Opposition MP Nikol Pashinyan, who's led the protests, called for a non-violent revolution, urging Armenians to go on strike and blockade government buildings. But will their bold efforts make any difference? Christine Provolakis has this report.
Protests swell in Armenia as the former president, Serge Sargsyan, begins his new job. He's now the prime minister after parliament voted 77-17 in his favor. It's being seen by many as a power grab. Demonstrators backed by the opposition fought with police in the capital Yerevan for the 5th straight day. Dozens were arrested as they tried to block government buildings.
We are here to fight against the crimes of the past 10 years. Our main problem is the total lack of democracy in our country.
My president has cheated the people. He said that he won't rule for a 3rd time, that he won't be the head of the state. I want justice. I want to live in a free Armenia.
Sargsyan stepped down from his 2nd and final presidential term earlier this month. He initiated constitutional amendments 3 years ago for Armenia to switch from a presidential system to a parliamentary one. After a successful referendum to back the change, the prime minister was made the country's most powerful leader. The transfer of power downgraded the newly elected president, Armen Sargsyan, to more of a figurehead. At the time, Sargsyan swore he never wanted to be prime minister. Now he's making sure he stays in power indefinitely. Sargsyan was first elected president in 2008, but his rise to power has not been a peaceful one. His initial election set off mass protests as opposition activists protested against ballot results, leaving 8 people dead and more than 100 injured. Critics say excessive force has been used throughout his tenure to break up largely peaceful demonstrations, including people protesting electricity price hikes in 2015. More than 30% of the population live below the poverty line, and 300,000 people have fled abroad in the past 10 years. Sargsyan is also seen by critics as Russia's man, and despite promises to fight corruption, the economy remains in the hands of several oligarchs. As Armenia transitions from a presidential to a parliamentary system, many were hoping to see real change. But now they see that opportunity lost, as the same man has all the power. Christine Provolakis, the newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from Yerevan is Richard Garagosian. He is the director of the Regional Studies Center in Armenia. Also in Yerevan, we have Maria Karapetyan. She is the leader of the Reject Surge movement. And completing our panel is Lilit Gevorgyan. She is a Russia analyst and joins us live from London. Thanks all so much for speaking to us. Let me begin with Richard. What is going on here? I mean, from the outside, it just looks like yet another ploy for a leader to circumvent the Constitution and hold on to power. Is it that simple?
In many ways, unfortunately, yes, it is that simple. This is more of a continuation of power by a ruling elite. But what's most interesting is the broader context. The government's plan for this parliamentary transformation is clearly not going according to the original plan. What we see is a rather unexpected determination by thousands of demonstrators, clearly anxious to register their opposition to this rather arrogance of power. What this also means, however, is not yet a revolutionary moment, but clearly well short of any resolution. Therefore, what we can expect reasonably is a deepening of simmering discontent and popular dissent, meaning that for both the opposition and the government, it will be very difficult, if not challenging, to return to a degree of normalcy.
Okay, Lilit, Sarkisyan said he didn't believe anyone should serve more than 2 terms as a leader. And it's led some people to call him actually Armenia's Putin. Why is he doing this?
Well, I think I agree with the previous speaker that the transition to parliamentary democracy was a parliamentary system of government was a very convenient way of getting rid of those constraints on presidential terms. He is not an inventor of this sort of method of staying in power. I'd like to remind you that this was done also in Georgia, where the previous president Saakashvili was also trying to sort of stay in power in a similar fashion, which didn't work. Now, another example is Kyrgyzstan, where they also transitioned from presidential to parliamentary system. However, there was a condition, and the condition was that whoever was standing as a president wouldn't run for prime minister's position, and that worked. So what Sarkisyan did effectively said at a time, also to a degree to appease to the European Union, and especially Venice Commission, to say that, well, look, this is a genuine effort to bring more democracy to Armenia.
Okay.
And he backtracked.
Okay. Maria, let me ask you, we know where you stand. You head up the Reject Surge movement itself. So tell us, what are the alternatives? If it's not Serge Sarkisyan, and we have to remind our viewers as well that the parliament voted overwhelmingly in favor of keeping him in power, but as prime minister, what would be better for Armenia? Is there an alternative that the opposition can actually present?
Right. Let me start with challenging that last point about the parliament voting overwhelmingly in favor. The group of people that has gathered in the National Assembly of Armenia has as little representational authority, or it actually has less representational authority than any 100 people that have gathered in any square of the cities of Yerevan today. Those people represent the society of Armenia much better than those that stand in the National Assembly. So right now we are in Armenia in a situation of a de facto constitution, in a de facto people who are in power, whereas the reality is quickly changing in the streets. Yeah, people are in the streets voting. The alternatives, I think that there are very many different political powers in Armenia that have various visions about what are the alternatives. And right now, I do not believe that there should be one concrete, specific, very detailed, structured vision. Of course, there needs to be an open debate. First, we need to remove this structure that has been keeping everyone blocked. And then there could be an open debate about the possibilities of how we want to move forward, because there is a lot of conversation about whether this transition to a parliamentary system was entirely staged to consolidate the power in Serge Sarkisyan's hands, or was it something that really was a necessary transition to democracy? So all of the processes that Armenia has gone through the last few years are challenged.
Okay.
So did we really need those things, or we need to actually unroll them?
Okay. Richard, I seemed you had something to say, but if not, I'd like to switch gears slightly in a question with you, but go ahead.
Well, I wanted to add, in terms of being fairly a little more objective, my criticism is equally shared by the opposition. And at this point, despite the intensity, the emotion, and the understandable frustration, I'm not sure that there is necessarily a viable alternative yet. But as indicated, The problem itself is now systemic, whether it's endemic corruption or systemic in terms of a closed political system. But I don't think any individual political party or politician will necessarily be the one answer for Armenia. What we need is to change political culture. And in effect, the lack of a free and fair election for so many years in Armenia is really the fundamental obstacle.
Okay. It's actually making democracy seem almost like a foreign institution more and more. But let me ask you this, Richard. I mean, part of what we saw in Georgia as well, Lilith had referred to Saakashvili. You know, the West was very pro-Georgia because Saakashvili himself was a Western-leaning leader. In the end, it didn't seem that that was actually what the Georgian people wanted, no matter how it was portrayed outside the country. Some say that's a bit of what we're seeing now in Armenia, that Serge Sargsyan leaned toward Russia. Now, that's not very popular in the West, but within Armenia, it is playing out relatively well. Is that the case?
I would actually argue no. Ironically, just the opposite. Ironically, what we see under Sargsyan is a rare, belated recognition of the limits of the dangerous over-reliance on Russia. We see Armenia at the end of last year formally accepting and fully negotiating a new comprehensive agreement with the European Union. We see a new challenge to the relationship with Russia. We see the Armenian government still committed to normalization with Turkey, for example. Ironically, in foreign policy, Sargsyan and his government remains fairly credible and fairly competent. It's the domestic situation, however, that presents the bigger problems. But I would say the real obstacle here is much less Russia and much more the internal situation.
Okay.
Ironically, however, there will come a point where perhaps Moscow begins to express concern over their reliance on the current Armenian government. Because after all, the former prime minister of Armenia is a Gazprom executive who was sent to Armenia from Moscow.
Richard alludes to something important there, that many say Sargsyan's leadership is very closely tied with Armenia's oligarchs. The accusation that Sargsyan and his cohorts are very closely tied and entrenching the power, essentially, of Armenia's oligarchs.
Yeah, I would rather say it's a description rather than an accusation, because truly Serge Sargsyan is the head of that pyramid where different interest groups have been put into place to support each other, yeah? And that's why the smallest common denominator for all of the civic movements and the political parties right now in this strife are targeting him personally. And the initiative that I'm part of, Reject Serge, also targets him. But this doesn't mean that the only change that we want to see is his non-return to power or removal from power. There is much more that goes beyond it. But since this person is the one that keeps this system into a state of homeostasis, if we change him, then everything will start collapsing in that system of oligarchic power in the politics.
What does it mean to have, if it is, as Maria was describing, a leader in Armenia that is so closely tied to the oligarchs of the country?
Well, I mean, the fact that Armenian economy is suffering because of the high concentration of economic power in hands of few has been recognized by international organizations and lenders, including IMF. So it's not an allegation, rather a fact and a serious problem for Armenia's economic development. So in this sense, one of the reasons why there is so much discontent is precisely because of this economic system not working for ordinary Armenians. And I'll bring you one example why it's not working. Armenia posted 7.5% annual growth in 2017. It's a remarkable number that many countries in the world will be very much envious of. But at the same time, the poverty levels in the country are rising, which suggests that there is an extreme polarization of wealth in the country. And this is happening because of the oligarchic system. An oligarchy strives and thrives in Armenia simply because it has also the political power. So what, in a nutshell, we're seeing on the streets of Armenia is a message that we don't know how we're going to change the system, but it's a message that it's not working. And it's not really about the leaders on the street who is leading them or what agenda they have. It is simply expression of a desperation, saying that the economy is not working and your foreign policy is not working either. Because when Armenia was joining Eurasia Union, led by Russia, and leaving the association agreement with European Union behind, the promise from Sarkisyan's government was that Armenia would benefit from Russian investment, from cheap gas, and there will be solid security guarantees for Armenia and Nagorno-Karabakh.
Okay.
And none of this has worked.
Right. I mean, Richard, your connection has been established again. That kind of brings us back to the initial point that you were talking about when you disagreed with Maria. This is not, according to all of you, the ideal leadership for Armenia, but is it the best of poor alternatives?
I would argue yes, but for a slightly different reason. The reason I'm optimistic clearly is because Sargsyan, as former president, now as prime minister, is very much the last of the Mohicans, the last of this oligarchic elite. The new transformation has also been matched by a political transition to much younger faces, even within the ruling Republican Party. And this demographic change is largely inspiring change because they realize there is no alternative but reform. And it's not only political weakness or lack of legitimacy, it's economic vulnerability that will force open the closed economic system. But in many ways, it's too premature to predict where this is going. But it's inevitable that change is now much past due.
Okay. Lilit, if you had a comment, I could see you disagreed. Go ahead. If not, I'd like to move on to Maria. Go ahead.
I disagree on one point that I see a transition to younger politicians from the same party, from the same ruling oligarchic elite, is a simple cosmetic move. In fact, I would argue that it's even dangerous because the only advantage that this supposed progressive leaders, young leaders have is just their age gap with the current leaders. And they have formed their vision, their skills that they've acquired in a oligarchic, in a corrupt system. I do not think that they have vision. They have progressed their career in a system which is not based on meritocracy. So I do not think that they have the skills and qualities to lead to change.
Okay. That's definitely a less optimistic outlook. And I want to get final words from Maria, not just on that, the fact that the only difference between the youth, the old guard and the new guard possibly in Armenia is the age gap, but also the fact that, you know, somewhere between 270 and 370,000 people have emigrated from Armenia. You can call it even a brain drain if you want. That is never healthy for a country. What could bring them back, or do you fear that actually that brain drain might increase now that this government has headed on the path it's headed on?
Well, first of all, I think we're in a process that is actually on its way to its culmination. So I'm very hopeful that this is going to be the beginning of changes in Armenia. And I do not want to consider the scenario of further stagnation and more emigration out of the country. But truly, the people that have emigrated are partially the let's say, the young minds that have not seen the realization of their dreams in this country, and also people that have not seen that have not found jobs to stay in this country. And also adding to that emigration is the growing poverty rate, which has grown by some few percent, which might seem small, but if you take into consideration that part of the people that have emigrated are already from the poorest layers of the society, then this growth, or the remaining like 30% of poor poverty in Armenia, shows that more and more layers of the society are getting poorer and poorer. But coming back to your point about bright minds and their possible return, I do believe that people that leave Armenia still maintain some ties with the society, with the country. They join the diaspora communities and stay in touch. So there is the possibility that if they see a vision, if they see the way towards changes, some people might come back. And right now, even, we are hearing a lot of the voices from the communities that have gone out of the country in support of these changes. And we do hope that there will be more voices joining.
Okay, Maria, I will have to give you the last word. Unfortunately, we're out of time for this segment of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of our panelists so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Still to come, 4 years after Flint's water crisis, the U.S. state of Michigan stops distributing free bottled water, saying its own water supplies are safe, but are residents ready to trust their government again? And the Democratic Republic of Congo boycotts a conference aimed at raising money for its own humanitarian crisis. Well, it's taken 4 years, but apparently Flint, Michigan's water crisis is over. That's according to the state, which has stopped providing free bottled water for those who couldn't drink from their taps. It all began in 2014 when local officials were accused of cutting corners and allowing dangerous levels of poisonous lead to enter the city's water supply. Since then, thousands in Flint have been affected, and 15 officials linked to the crisis were charged with crimes, including involuntary manslaughter. Now, some experts say the water is completely safe, but whether residents are ready to believe them is another question entirely. For more, here's Natalie Pohonen.
The residents of Flint, Michigan were at the center of one of America's worst public health emergencies when their water supply was found to be contaminated with lead. They had been given access to free bottled water, but the distribution has been stopped. The state says there's no need for it anymore because the water now meets federal standards. In 2014 and 2015, officials changed the water source piped into Flint homes to river water, which wasn't properly treated, to cut costs.
Take it off, it's kind of hard.
That resulted in lead leaching out of old pipes into the water supply. At least 8,000 children are believed to have consumed lead-contaminated water. More than 6,000 water pipes have been replaced, but there are still thousands more that need the same treatment. Here's Flint's mayor on a conversation she had this week with Michigan Governor Rick Snyder.
The governor said we need to get over it. He said the water is testing well and we need to move on. I told him we know how the water is testing, but our argument is we have not put in all of the lead service lines. We have not removed them and put in the new pipes. So that was an issue, and it's an issue of safety, and it's an issue of public health, and putting public health over cost and profit.
The governor's office says Flint's water has tested below the federal government's action level for lead, which is 15 parts per billion. Between January and March, samples showed 4 parts per billion. That places Flint's water quality ahead of cities like Chicago and Philadelphia. The governor says the state will now focus its efforts on continuing with the health, education and economic development assistance needed to help move Flint forward. But some people still don't trust the authorities. More than a dozen state and local officials have been charged in connection with the crisis. In 2016, President Barack Obama visited the community and drank filtered Flint water.
This was a man-made disaster. This was avoidable. This was preventable.
And that's one of the main reasons why people continue to raise their voice, because they were exposed to the contamination in the first place. Natalie Pohonen, The Newsmakers.
Joining me now from Virginia in the United States is Dr. Siddharth Roy. He is a research scientist at Virginia Tech University and was part of the team that helped uncover the Flint water crisis. And in East Lansing, in Michigan, is Jessica Matthews. She is a high school teacher in Flint and an environmental justice activist. Thanks both so much for joining us. Sid, if I can, let me start with you. Just tell us, from a scientific standpoint now, is Flint's water supply ready for general consumption?
So that's a great question, and the answer is a little bit nuanced. In August 2015, when we worked with Flint residents to uncover citywide lead contamination, the testing clearly showed that there was a huge problem and citizens were at risk. And it was the same testing we carried out throughout 2016, again with residents, and the latest in August of 2017, which showed a steady decrease in these lead levels. And to this day, Flint is meeting all federal standards when it comes to contaminants. So right now, from a federal standpoint, absolutely, Flint's water is meeting standards. And the state's testing is showing the same thing. And another researcher at Michigan State University just released her study 4 days ago. She was part of this team that was asked to test because of a part of a settlement, so that an independent team can come in and use science to show what was going on. And even she found that the lead results in Flint are now meeting all federal standards.
Okay, would you drink it?
Great question. So I personally would drink water through a filter. The reason I say that is because Flint is similar to any city in the US with old lead pipes. And if you have lead pipes in your system, I cannot guarantee that you will not have lead ever. Therefore, my recommendation is always, no matter which city you're in, to use a lead filter.
Okay. Jessica, from your point of view, I mean, it wasn't just about the battle to actually clean up Flint's water supply. It's now a battle to win back the trust of the people in Flint. Do you trust your local leaders anymore?
I do not trust the decisions that have been made for the citizens of Flint. There has been a lack of transparency on a number of issues that have gone on within the city to explain the process in which of saying, yes, all of a sudden this water is safe for us to drink. There haven't been a lot of updates for people to read, to see the whole process in which they made for us to say, it's okay for us to get to this point where we can drink out of the tap. So I, along with a number of people with the government decisions, are uncomfortable with such a rushed act of saying, yes, everyone, let's start to begin to drink out of the tap again.
And in the meantime, Jessica, I mean, they've ended the free bottled water program, but only, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, just over a third, at last I heard, of the contaminated lead pipes have actually been replaced. And now you have Dr. Mona Hanna-Attisha, who actually led the Hurley Medical Center lead poisoning study. She just tweeted that this is wrong. Until all lead pipes are replaced, we need to make filters and bottled water free. Is that the same mission you're on, that at the very least there still needs to be the free distribution of clean bottled water and filters, Jessica?
I completely agree with Dr. Mona. There are specific areas within the city where the pipes have been changed, but as it was stated, 2/3 of the city hasn't received those pipes. So for us to ignore that there were parts of the city that had 5 times the parts per billion of lead that should be allowed in water, and suddenly look and say, we need you to go ahead and switch over to a filter, which the filters we were using weren't working for them as well, to suddenly go, now it's your responsibility to buy your own bottled water, pay for the water that we can't use to begin with, and trust us that this process will happen. I find that completely unfair for the citizens of Flint. How long are we supposed to wait to see that justice can be complete? If you don't care enough to take care of us until all the pipes are replaced,
I want to ask further
why
about...
would we trust you?
Yeah, and I want to ask a little bit further about that justice in just a second. But before we go on, Sid, let me ask you, because I want to return to what you were saying, that this water actually does meet federal standards. But then what does it say, perhaps, about the federal standards and the state of water not just in the public supply, but in the private supply as well. I mean, is there a reality we need to accept here that all water supplies are going to be questionable, especially given that bottled water is now been deemed to contain what could be dangerous microplastics?
So, I don't have any expertise in microplastics, but from a federal standpoint, I will tell you that in the aftermath of Flint, there have been wide-ranging investigations across the country, and more than 5,000 water systems were shown in 2016 to be failing the federal standard. So to be honest, first off, you do have a widespread problem because of aging infrastructure, lead pipes that are still in the ground in every major U.S. city, and lead-bearing plumbing like brass faucets inside homes that could leach lead, even if you do everything right when it comes to water treatment. And also that the standard is not very strong. I mean, what the standard says is, if 90% of homes, high-risk homes that have a lead pipe tested, have less than 15 parts per billion, you're in compliance. So what that obviously means is 10% of homes can have any levels of lead, and you're in compliance. So that is unacceptable, and I think EPA and the state of Michigan are both trying to strengthen the law so that we can catch these issues as they occur. But to bring back to Flint, if they had followed the weak federal law in the first place, if they had treated the water right and tested it accurately, they would have detected a widespread problem. And they did, but they covered it up. And so now I am not the least bit surprised that not one resident in Flint trusts the state, the local government, or the federal agencies. Why would they? I mean, they were betrayed, and this man-made disaster was caused. But it's a problem that is not unique to Flint. It is a nationwide issue. And
that's frightening. Jessica, I saw you nodding your head in agreement, and I wanted to come back to the issue of justice that you raised. How much do you think appropriate punishment, if it is delivered, will redeem the leadership in the city of Flint? I mean, right now we have just over a dozen officials that have been charged, some of them with involuntary manslaughter, but not yet sentenced. How closely will you be watching those sentences and to see the precedent that they set and perhaps learn to trust your government again?
I think it's really important for us to emphasize, I am a teacher in the city of Flint. And we teach children that there is right and there's wrong, and there are consequences for what is wrong. So in seeing that the people that have been charged so far, that's wonderful. I'd like to see what other people will be charged dealing with this issue. It wasn't that just those 12 people. This was a decision that was made from the top all the way down in order for them to change the water due to money. So I know one thing that I will look very closely is how serious are we taking for these higher up officials who are elected to take care of the people to be held accountable for what they've done. So far, a lot of people, including me in the city of Flint, were very leery on those people actually being charged because we haven't seen any progress. So what steps are we going to make for progress for people to be made whole in the city of Flint?
Let me put this question to both of you. As people living in the United States, do you fear that the Flint water crisis really is actually symbolic of some very serious major infrastructure issues across the country, actually? I mean, from the state of roads and airports that we've seen crumbling to kind of a general lack of maintenance on large public works projects. It seems the U.S. has really just consumed its infrastructure. And do you think enough is being done to maintain, replace, or at the very least improve it? Sid, go ahead.
Perfect. Two things. First off, in the aftermath of Flint, there has been a lot of soul searching, a lot of actual investigations into seriously looking at issues. And, the more we look, the more we find. And infrastructure is one of the few issues where there is bipartisan support on actually, funding it, fixing it, making sure that the country's economic development, is not hindered because of these issues. So we are finally having a conversation of what it means to have safe water in America, and I'm very happy that's happening. There's also the point of injustice. The definition of environmental justice is if a population is not getting the same level of protection that the other people in the country are. It's injustice. And that is what happened in Flint. And so it is happening in other communities. And, we have to find both the funding and the will of these government agencies, of civil servants, working at these places to do their jobs and make sure people are not being put at risk for no fault of their own.
And Jessica, as an activist, what are you doing to meet those ends?
I think it's really important for us to emphasize, especially when we're doing activism and work like this, that Flint is everywhere. This is not a case of just one location, which has been stated before. The concern of infrastructure, which is the really important part we need to understand about the water crisis, is that it became an infrastructure issue that went into the water. So in being a person who's going to be an activist, we need to demand that we get the right standards in all kinds of aspects when it comes to infrastructure. If we're going to think about money, we need to put money in the right way. We don't need to do it to cut corners where we are affecting the people. All our decisions are supposed to be made to help the people, not to hurt the people. And so Flint has been this prime example of we need to make the right decisions so that we are actually protecting and helping people.
On a larger scale, do you think the federal government in place now is on the right track toward doing that? Or do you fear what some say is the degradation of the EPA, for example, under this new leadership?
I think what happened to Flint was an example where we needed to start the race, but the race is not complete. Okay. We started to see that there has got to be this track that we have to run in order to get to the right standards for people. It is not done yet because this can happen anywhere and it can be anybody who's affected, and we need to continue to do the race together as a group of people. How are we going to make the change together and finish the race?
Okay, Sid, as far as investment is concerned, though, when you hear the White House say some $1.7 trillion is going to be invested in infrastructure projects, do you look forward to seeing those steps taken? Do you think that's going to put things on a more solid ground?
I mean, absolutely. What happened in Flint is a disaster. It's unacceptable. So therefore, the fact that there is will on all levels of government to continue investing is huge. To give you just one example, we will need up to $1 trillion in the next 25 years to replace all the aging pipes across the country. The average age of pipes in Flint is 85 years. They are way, they're at the end of their lifetime. So I'm hoping, and I'm looking forward to investments not just in infrastructure, but in updating of standards, of making sure federal standards are enforced so that people stay protected.
Okay, Jessica, if there's an upside to any of this, do you think Flint, the people of Michigan, have come out, has Flint come out a stronger city? Are you seeing people engaged finally in a way that they haven't been before, so that you do feel like there is, in a sense, a silver lining in this tragedy?
People in the city of Flint have been strong people from the beginning. They've fought through all kinds of obstacles, loss of GM, people fleeing from the city for all kinds of different reasons. But the one thing I will say about people from the city of Flint, when we need to step up, we do step up. And so being put in this disaster, a number of people have taken the decision to say, we're going to keep talking. We're going to keep making sure there's a focus on this issue. Even though it's been 4 years, we're still focused on it. And we're going to find a way in order for us to build up, not only for the people of now, but the generations to come. So I think we'll stand strong. We'll keep doing what we need to do, but we do need help with people to help us in the focal area of making sure that we are a group that's not forgotten.
Okay, Jessica Matthews, I'll let you have the last word. Thank you so much, Jessica and Siddharth Roy, for joining us on this edition of The Newsmakers.
The absence of the Democratic Republic of Congo is regrettable and is also incomprehensible. To put an end to human suffering, Congolese leaders should take this humanitarian crisis seriously.
Well, it was a conference to help raise funds for the Democratic Republic of the Congo. The UN says the Central African country needs at least $1.7 billion this year to tackle the humanitarian crisis. And around 100 delegates got the ball rolling, raising more than $500 million in Geneva. But one notable absentee was the DRC itself. The government boycotted the event accusing the United Nations of exaggerating the humanitarian crisis. Now, according to the Kinshasa government, only 230,000 people have been displaced. That's a far cry from the UN estimate of 4.5 million displaced people in the country. Well, to help us better understand what's happening, I'm joined from Leicester in the UK by Michael Shibangu. He is the president of the Association for Development and Democracy in Congo. And in Brussels, we have former aid worker Chris Barhutz. He is the author of Congo's Violent Peace, Conflict, and Struggle Since the Great African War. Thanks both so much for joining us. Michael, let me begin with you. Did the DRC lose out by not participating in this donors conference, or did the government make a point that needed to be made?
Well, I think the people of DRC lose out. I think it's important to understand that we have a government that does not care about the people. This explains this callous attitude. The people of DRC will lose out because we have millions of people who are internally displaced, people who are in dire need of help, and they needed international assistance. And the fact that the government boycotted it is actually very deplorable, very disappointing. So it's the people that will suffer, not the government that. Not the government of DRC that is actually, we have a president who's actually out of term and is trying to sweep this under the carpet because he feels that the situation does not portray his leadership well.
Okay. Chris, are you on the same page?
Well, yes, of course, the situation at the ground is extremely complex, and that has to do with the uncertainties around the immediate political future, let's say, of Congo. It is not clear where we're going to in terms of the electoral process, and this has an impact on local tensions and local conflicts.
Now, both of you have portrayed this as almost a question of President Joseph Kabila's ego and his government's ego and not wanting to really expose the Democratic Republic of the Congo for the crisis that it harbors at the moment, and that innocent people will suffer as a result of that. But Michael, there's a bigger issue at play here, and other African countries have complained about the same. And this is the point that the DRC government is making, that the United Nations and the NGOs exaggerate humanitarian crises across Africa so that they can justify their funding, they can raise more money for their own means, while they cripple the DRC's efforts and other African countries' efforts to try and attract foreign investors. And it keeps African countries dependent on aid from foreign powers. Do you see any truth to that?
And I think it's just a way of avoiding to deal with the real situation. If there is a crisis in DRC, it is because the government of DRC has failed its people. It's because you have a leader who has been in power for 17 years. And despite the fact that he's been in power for 17 years, he has not been able to provide the security for his people. There are crises. And you see the humanitarian situation on the ground is not only getting worse, but it's also spreading geographically. I think that the core issue here is one of leadership. Whilst a case can be made to say that perhaps the funds aimed at people who are suffering should be better managed, but that in it all does not excuse the real issue, the real problem, which is a government that is not doing well, and not a government that is also very corrupt. We have an issue of corruption. We have a leader that is out of term and refuses to go. This further exacerbates the situation on the ground. Things are getting worse. You have people are trying to rise up protesting.
Michael, let me phrase it this way then. I mean, in your opinion, do these European powers, for example, involved in this conference, do they only want to do right by the Democratic Republic of Congo? Are their interests purely humanitarian, almost altruistic in a sense?
Well, there might be some political interests at stake, but I think it's important that we don't forget that the people who are suffering are in need of help. Whilst I agree that there's a need to manage better the fund that I am to support the people so that the people on the ground will benefit more, this, however, does not excuse the real issue, the cause of the problem. So you have there's an effect and the cause. The cause is the poor leadership of many African African leaders, particularly the leader of DRC, if they manage better the country, then there wouldn't be this need to raise funds and to support people. The government, like any other responsible government, will be able to manage the situation on its own without the need for international help, without the need for international aid.
Okay, let me get Chris's take on this then. I mean, the government of the Democratic Republic of the Congo has complained that NGOs and the United Nations, in a sense, have this perverse interest in exaggerating the crisis in the DRC, because that way they get more funding, they can sustain their employees, as long as they continue to justify that a need is there. So it is a selfish interest of these NGOs and the United Nations to say that this crisis is much bigger than it is. Other African countries have complained about the same thing. I'm wondering if you think that they have a point.
Yeah, I think it's very important to understand that the Democratic Republic of Congo at this point is in a very difficult dialogue with the international community and on different issues, and most of all on the forthcoming elections and how they have to be organized. And I think the main point is that the DRC, the government of the DRC, absolutely wants to keep the steering wheel of the different processes in their own hands. So they are, to a certain extent, reluctant of a wave of humanitarian aid taking shape without them being very involved. So that's why they have been insisting on a more active and more visible place. But when we talk about humanitarian crisis, I have the tendency to believe, I think that the government is presenting a picture which is below the reality, that the reality is more serious than the government wants us to believe. The government seems to have a difficulty to admit that situation on the ground in the field is slipping out of their hands.
Okay, but Michael, I mean, I have to bring this back to this very sensitive issue here, and that perhaps there is corruption within Joseph Kabila's government. We'll move on to some other issues as well that he has been trying, he says, to crack down on that corruption. But in the meantime, he says that this aid that is almost being forced on the DRC actually hinders the development of private industry and foreign investment. Now, just speak as a Congolese yourself. Does that concern you? Is there an issue here with development, private sector development being hindered because of a dependence on aid?
Absolutely not. The one thing that is hindering private development in DRC is the corrupt government that we have. The government that is actually making it hard for businesses to operate freely. When you get to DRC, you have to pay bribes here and there. So many people are finding it very difficult to do business in DRC. They are having to move to a country where they can actually do business easily. And on top of that, you also have the instability that is linked to the political process where the government does not want to go. As a result, their attention on the street. We've seen the government cracking down on protesters, killing protesters. This, of course, if you are an investor, you would be very wary in terms of investing in a country where there is political instability.
But we're hearing out of the DRC just today, actually, that you say they're cracking down on protests, but they say they're actually cracking down on corruption. And in that process, Joseph Kabila has just fired some 256 judges for not, first of all, even having law degrees or having charges of corruption filed against them. Do you see that at least as a positive step toward trying to rid corruption in the DRC?
Well, I think it's just something that he's doing to trying to improve his image. Who appointed those judges without law degree? It's the same person that then appointed them, and now after a while he decided that they didn't have law degree. If you appoint people without law degrees, then it means yourself you're incompetent, because you're supposed to check those things. Those people have worked for years. People have been sentenced by those judges who were not legally qualified to work as judges, and to do that now, and again, it just shows that he is not in control of the situation, and he himself is now part of the problem. Whilst sacking those judges is a good thing, but it also shows that there is a serious problem that Kabila has been letting, that is not managing well, and those problems have consequences, not only for the Congolese people themselves, but also for businesses. When you have those judges that do not, that are corrupt, where those judges that do not have the legal qualification, the necessary qualification to work in the industry, they will take bad decisions, and people will be affected. And again, it's just highlight the problem that we have in DRC, which is systematic, a system that needs to be totally reformed. Otherwise, we'll continue to have the problem that we have. The humanitarian situation will get worse. So we need to sort out this question of leadership.
Okay, Chris, just a final question to you. I mean, what needs to be done in the immediate term to help the millions of people you say are affected by this humanitarian crisis in the DRC?
I think the DRC has, for generations, a governance problem. And this governance problem can only find a start of a solution if we come to free and fair elections in the short run and before the end of the year, and that a political change can take shape. At this moment, the government is very unpopular because of the bad governance.
Just a final thought. I mean, free and fair elections are only helpful if they can have good candidates running on the tickets. I'd like to thank both of you so much for joining us on this edition of The Newsmakers. Well, that's all for this edition of The Newsmakers with me, Andrea Sankey. Remember, you can check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe. Next time, Cuba's National Assembly picks a new leader. What will the country look like without a Castro as president? Until then, thanks for watching. Goodbye.